Okay, everyone. Again, this is building on GitHub with Probot. Hopefully, if that's what you're looking to hear about, you're already here. And if not, you don't know to not be here. So thank you all for coming. I'm Jamie Jones. I'm a solutions architect here at GitHub, working mostly with our government and public sector customers, but also some of our regulated and compliant restrictive customers, so financial services, healthcare, other folks along those natures. So I work out in the field. I work out with both of our GitHub Enterprise customers, as well as GitHub.com, open source organizations based in Washington, D.C., open source enthusiast, as you can imagine, which helps tie us into this talk right here. So this talk and my interest in Probot, if you haven't heard about before, you'll learn all about it during this talk, comes from what is in reality a typical day in my life out in the field talking to customers. It goes something like this. I want GitHub to do a thing, right? Whether it's code review, whether it's static code analysis, whether it's making my toast for me, can you just help me make GitHub do the thing? And I typically then go to that customer or that prospective customer or that open source group and say, have you tried Marketplace? Have you tried WorksWith? Right? So as you've already heard today and talk about platform and ecosystem, we have Marketplace, which makes it really easy to add tools into your GitHub.com environment, really add a lot of functionality. And if that doesn't have what you need, there's WorksWith. Over 150 integrations. We've categorized them and list them all out for you. So there's a lot of great things you can do. But then that's not what the customer's looking for, right? It's like, I don't want that thing. I want this new thing. And so I'm like, cool, great. We have this great API. It's awesome. You can build on top of it. A lot of other people have done that already. You know, before we had code review, we saw a lot of work done with tools like Review Ninja or Looks Good to Me. And then even past that, we see things like Raygun and Sentry and the CLA bot, which helps to ensure that all contributors to a project have assigned the appropriate CLA so they can contribute their code. All of this is awesome, right? But that's not what the customer says, right? The customer's like, that's so hard. It's going to take too much time. I have to deal with authentication, OAuth tokens, HTTP headers for previews. This is all too much for me to deal with. And that's where I can bring in my friend Probot to help answer these questions. So if you don't know yet, hopefully you will at the end of this talk, there will be a quiz. Probot is a bot framework for building things on top of GitHub, right? It encapsulates all the key things needed to build GitHub integrations yourself and make it very easy. There's a web page, probot.github.io, that you can find out more information after this talk. So let's look at some examples of Probot bots that are out there. Probot apps, I guess, is the proper terminology for them, that are out there already, right? You see in the top left is the new issue welcome bot. This helps you when you have a new contributor on board to your project. It can give a brief overview, maybe point them towards docs, the contributing information, or general things that you would want all new contributors or users to know when they join your project. Automate it with Probot. In the middle, you have the stale bot. This is one of our most popular bots that we've seen deployed almost 200 times throughout the community, that basically can let you mark issues as stale and close them after a certain amount of time period. For those of you who are used to maintaining open source projects, environments, apps, you get a lot of great feedback from the community, but not all of it's actionable. Maybe some of it's just comments, maybe some of it's pie in the sky features they'd like to see in the future. Stale lets you come back and automatically after 3 months, 6 months, 90 days, whatever it may be, and say, hey, thanks for this feedback, but I'm going to go ahead and close it for the time being. And finally, at the bottom, we have reminders, which is another sort of Probot app, which actually uses a command API so that you can remind yourself to come back to this issue in the future, right? Maybe it's because you're going on leave, or maybe because you're waiting on another feature to ship before you can tackle this bug or issue. You can set a reminder to yourself, hey, remind me at some time in the future to pop this notification back up to me. A lot of really interesting things that sort of help to build onto the GitHub workflow. Another great example for Probot app right now is the to-do bot or to-do app. This will look when you merge code that still has to-dos in them. It'll go ahead and open up a new issue for you in your repository with the to-do and some information from that to-do to remind you to go ahead and fix it in the future. You can imagine where you can take an app like this. Maybe you don't open up an issue. Maybe you spawn off a branch and open up a pull request. Maybe you can start sort of automating some of the tools, again, reading the comments, reading the lines to help make this process easier. As we saw earlier today with help wanted labels and other ways to onboard and find new contributors to your project, you could integrate that with the to-do app to really streamline this process. So these are Probot apps that are available today. but not the only ones, right? So on the Probot website, we list over 17, 13 right now. I'm sure the number's higher than when I took this screenshot a couple weeks ago. But these are apps already out there, self-registered by the community, that you can go ahead and install onto your repositories right now. This is a great way to sort of explore and see some of the things that are already out there. So Troy Spruitt from Collective Idea, when getting ready to do this talk, I asked out in the community for people who have been working with Probot if they had any quotes, they had any advice they'd give. Because again, this talk for me is hopefully to give best practices, to get you all excited to build with Probot, but then to give you best practices so when you're building yourself, you're sort of have a leg up. You're not starting from scratch. And so this was the quote he gave, which I think really sums up where Probot is and why it's so helpful to me and hopefully all of you. Probot solved the problem so simply for us and saved us a ton of time. We were no longer looking for authentication and the other complications of getting going. So again, if you have a key takeaway from this, is Probot makes building with GitHub simple. It's under rapid development right now, open source. You can see all the code and contribute pull requests or features at your will by a vibrant open source community and improving every day. So let's talk about what Probot really is under the covers and why it's able to be so easy and so stable already. So back at GitHub Satellite, much like Universe, but in Europe, Defunct in May announced that GitHub gets more API traffic on a daily basis than we do get traffic from the web UI. So think about what that means. That means that the API A must be rich enough so that people can use it, but B, that it must be accessible enough. Now I'd question though that if it's accessible enough to get more traffic than the UI does, how much could it really be getting? So looking at the features we have of the API right now, at Satellites when we announced GitHub Apps as well, so a new way to communicate and to authenticate into GitHub. But of course we have alongside of it the REST API, webhooks, and GraphQL. A lot of you, as we're talking about extending on GitHub, are probably familiar with something like this, the GitHub Developer Docs, where you go and you can see what APIs we have, what data we return, what data we take in, and sort of how to find everything. But I don't know if you're like me, I hate using this. Right? Like, not that the docs aren't complete, but am I doing curl commands from my command line? Am I trying to use some sort of API browser built into an IDE or my browser? No, I'm probably actually accessing the API through an SDK. Right? So this abstracts all of the API calls, all the functionality into the language and technology that I'm already using. Right? Maybe that's something like Node GitHub, so when I'm writing JavaScript code. Or maybe that's something like OctoKit when I'm writing Ruby code. And that's awesome. But this quote by, well, it could be by someone, is that APIs are nothing if they can't be easily built upon. I think that's really true, right? So we talked about how SDKs make communicating with either the REST API or the GraphQL API easy. There was a bunch of other things out there too. We talked about webhooks. We talked about GitHub Apps. And that's where Probot comes in, right? It's the glue for interacting with GitHub. So what it's really doing is it's abstracting away not only your SDK, but your webhooks and your GitHub apps to give you one simple framework for communicating with GitHub and all that you need. So before we go into what it actually looks like to build with Probot, of course, Probot's used by a lot of GitHub properties, right? Of course, GitHub itself, you see a lot of the open source developers for Probot being GitHub employees. And of course, then other technologies like Electron and Atom are building with Probot or using Probot for their repositories and orgs. But what really excites me is that group at the bottom, right? These are companies not really related to GitHub. I mean, they have GitHub orgs. They work with GitHub. They integrate with GitHub. But they're using Probot because it solves this problem for them, and it's made this easier. Waffle, I was looking at a repo yesterday where one of their new integrations to deal with projects is built on top of Probot. You see the same with Century, Auth0 and their Auth Extend product that they're looking at Probot. Keen.io and Collective Idea. These notions that while yes, some Probot apps like Stale make it really easy to manage your own GitHub workflow or your own GitHub repository and organization, it's also a strong enough platform, strong enough framework that you can build entire apps or businesses on it as well. We talk about the GitHub Marketplace and how that makes it easy to sort of share your integrations, share your tools out to the GitHub community. I'm really looking forward to the day where there are GitHub apps in the marketplace built entirely on Probot, because it makes it that easy. So specifically, what does Probot enable, right? It enables webhook and event registration, so you can easily handle events that happen on GitHub, whether by human, by code commit, by issue create, and parse them and manage them within your bot, within your app. It handles all of the GitHub integration and authentication for you. It uses GitHub apps under the cover, so you get the latest security models, permissions schemes, abstracts it all away. You're left with just a private key that you can give your app that can then interact directly with GitHub. And it simplifies the API interaction with those SDKs for you. One of the really nice things that it's doing right now, it's not just giving you access to the SDKs like Node GitHub. It's actually adding a little bit more syntactic sugar on top of it as well. So Brandon Keepers built out a pagination function that was not in the actual Node GitHub Node.js module and added it into Probot because we end up dealing with a lot of long issue threads. So being able to add in that syntactic sugar at the Probot level makes it really powerful. One of the things they're looking at right now is building out additional web UI capabilities. So let your Probot run as a web server and run web pages. Wouldn't it be nice if there were pre-made components using GitHub's style guide, its primer framework, so that you can make repo names look like on GitHub. Maybe you can style issue comments like GitHub styles them on github.com already. Build these components so you can easily add them into your app so you get a near native look and feel, or native look and feel even. So again, another quote. This is from Auth0, specifically the Auth0 Extend team who's looking at Probot right now. One of the coolest things is to have an instance of Node GitHub right there. Since most of my webhooks are interacting with GitHub anyway, right? They're using a paradigm where something happens on GitHub, they receive the webhook, and then they go and they take an action back on it, whether they merge a pull request, whether they close something, whether they spawn off something entirely different. All of these things don't happen in a vacuum, right? So talking about that earlier slide where I showed all of the 4 features of the platform side by side, they're all helpful in their own right, but you really need to integrate them together. And that's what Auth0 was using Probot for. So what does it look like to build a Probot app, right? So we've talked about why Probot's important and what it can do. What does it actually look like to put hands on a keyboard and build one? Well, the first thing you do is you stand up a brand new GitHub app, right? You go to your settings page, go to GitHub Apps, click the new GitHub app button, give it a name, a description. You can give it a nice little logo. You can see when I'm building these sort of mashups or these Probot apps, I like to use the logos of the different tools I'm putting together. So you see one I did with Red Hat's OpenShift product, as well as one with AWS's EC2 containers. Next, go ahead locally and instantiate your Probot app. It's really just a Node project right now. There's thoughts long-term about whether Probot wants to be supported in other languages as well. It was built in Node right now just for simplicity and ability to ship an MVP. But what does it look like long-term? Again, pull requests welcome to make Probot into your language of choice. Update the environment variables. So again, I mentioned you may download a private key for authentication, or you may store values about what other servers you want to hit. Go ahead and update that in your .env file. And finally, create a Node.js module that will be your Probot app. It takes in a robot parameter. It does something with it. You can see in this little snippet of code I have right there, it listens to the issues opened webhook event, and then just logs out the information that it got back from the server. That's it, robot on. You give it the GitHub webhook name, and you're off and running. That context variable has both the payload of the event, has access to the GitHub API, and has other information and helper methods that you can go and do more interesting things. So this is what it looks like to build an app from scratch. This is as simple as what a real app can be. This is 4 lines of code. This is the autoresponder app. Everyone's used out of office for emails, right? Or maybe if you're doing an open source project that was really important to you 3 years ago, but now you no longer have that smart fridge, or you no longer use that version of a smart TV, or whatever you built this open source tool for. So you still have the project out there, you still have the repo, but you're not actively working on it. And instead of getting issues from all of the people in the community who are like, hey, can you upgrade it to the newest version of this refrigerator? Or hey, can you use this great new API from this other person? Your answer is like, look, I appreciate it, you're welcome to do it, but I'm not going to do it anymore. The autoresponder app is a great way that you can set up Probot to do those responses for you. So again, looking at what this is, it listens to the issues opened event. It goes ahead and it reads an issue reply template from your GitHub repository. It reads that template into a proper string. And then it goes ahead and it writes it back to your GitHub repository as a comment following on to that original issue. That's 4 lines of code. And you've now automated your interaction for this closed or archived project with everyone in the world. No longer dealing with notifications. No longer dealing with the guilt of having to tell people no. Let the bot do it for you. Let the app do it for you. So a couple gotchas as you start thinking about your own Probot apps and what you want to do with them. Right now, since we're running on Node and we're using some of the latest features of Node, it does require a relatively new version. This becomes more of an issue when you want to deploy it to certain platforms, which are only providing access to the long-term releases of Node. Currently I know at the end of this month, Node jumps up to the next long-term release, which I think is 8, if I'm correct. So this should hopefully resolve some of those problems. But as you know, not all platforms, not all services will update that fast. Again, I do a lot of work with OpenShift as of late. I've been working with a bunch of customers there. And their platform only provides a Node 6 container to use. And I can't imagine that's going to be updated much before the beginning of next year. So just keep that in mind as a gotcha. One of the nice things about Probot is we give you a local development environment, as well as giving you an easy way to deploy it up to a cloud provider as well. We use a tool called Local Tunnel, which gives you a sort of a dynamic DNS route to your own local system. The only gotcha I would say here is make sure you give it a unique name. We've had developers in the past who have used Jamie's Probot, for example, as all of their DNS names, and they won't realize that app A is sending events to app B that they're currently deving and testing at that point. So definitely think about unique names. It's also something that needs to be stored in the GitHub app config. Don't forget to download the GitHub app private key. When you define the GitHub app, the private key is not something that's available at that point. It's only available on the next page. So I can count on 2 hands the amount of times I fire up an app and it can't connect to GitHub, can't authenticate. Like, what is going on? I know I checked my GitHub app configuration, I checked my env files, everything looks good, and it's, oh, that's right, I actually forgot to pull down the latest private key for this app. NPM install early and often. Like any good open source project that's under active development, there are new features being added at all times. So be sure to pull down the latest updates to those libraries and modules you're using. But like with all things NPM, just don't do it on an airplane. Don't do it on a train. Don't do it anywhere that you're not really comfortable with the Wi-Fi and the load you're about to stress on the system. A couple other notes when deploying to a pass. Make sure that it can start before the web request times out. We've had users playing around with Lambda, users playing around with other sort of deployment containers. And it takes the container itself a little while to spin up. So imagine you have a web request that times out in 10 seconds or 30 seconds. Can your container spin up before that web request times out? So again, gotchas to think about of where you deploy these applications to. And finally, GitHub app permissions can be frustrating. Understand the permission scheme. We're actively working on improving the layout of the GitHub apps permission scheme, making it clearer how webhooks are, what permissions are used for. So it's a gotcha that even I run into. I was talking internally to our platform support team, which if you haven't, as you've been building apps or building integrations on GitHub, if you've never emailed out to help to get info from them, they're great. But even I run into problems. There was something I was trying to do with pull request code reviews last week, and my app was just giving me unauthenticated, can't make this change. After talking to them, it was clear I just wasn't including the right permission in my app. So go ahead and do that. So if those are the gotchas, let's talk about some best practices for actually building apps with Probot. First, how you split up configurations. There's 3 distinct ways or places you can put configurations for your Probot app. One of them is where the user can get to it. We saw earlier with the autoresponder app, it read a configuration file out of the repo that autoresponder was installed onto. Things that you want your user to change, you want your user to customize, you want your user to manage, make them readable through that user configuration. We've actually made this simpler within Probot. We've added a helper method, config, which will read config files out of the .github directory and make them available to your Probot app. So again, the syntactic sugar that Probot allows to make this easier. App configuration. Anything that you want to just configure in your app itself, go ahead and build it out in the actual code. Why this is important to build it in config files, of course, rather than just hard code it. We mentioned the to-do app a little while ago. Right now, it opens issues. Maybe you want it in your workflow to open pull requests. That's a great configuration to put at the app level. So when you deploy this, you can set it however you want to set it. And finally, defaults. Whether you're setting things up for user configuration or app configuration, use sensible defaults. In a lot of ways, these configuration files are the guidance to everyone using your app or building on top of your app of what you expect to have happen. So by putting in sensible defaults, you can help guide them in creating their own tools. Assume you'll be running Probot stateless. While there is I think that's a pull request, that talks about how to provide stateful, both rational and non-rational database backend to Probot, for the most part, apps are built and designed to run stateless. So what that means is when you pull up your app, when your app first loads, it should be able to log into the GitHub repository and figure out the state of what's going on. Like the Reminders app, for example, it should search through all of the issues and find what issues it currently needs to be managing reminders for. This shouldn't be something it has to manage in a backend data store or something of that nature. This gets made easier a little bit by the extensions made available to Probot. So like any good modular system, build as much stuff as we can into Probot core, but then make it extensible. Provide the hooks and configurations so that it can grow and provide new functionality over time. One of those extensions is metadata. What metadata actually does is it lets you store data, configuration, information inside of GitHub issues. It takes advantage that GitHub issues themselves are HTML text. So whatever we render inside of an HTML comment tag doesn't actually appear on the screen to the user. But we can store data inside that HTML comment tag and then use that to manage the state of the app. So again, on this Reminders app we've been talking about, what it actually does is it stores on that parent issue when the reminder should pop in JavaScript date format. It stores what user it should actually respond to once that reminder pops. So when it does recover its state, it doesn't have to parse every comment. It can just go into the parent comment and read that data section. So the metadata plugin is one that sort of simplified both the reading, the writing and the reading of this data. Other things are scheduler. So maybe maybe you have actions that are not triggered by a webhook. You want to run every day, every hour, every week. Again, stale is a good example. It's running on a daily or weekly basis. It's not responding to a webhook that says, hey, I'm 90 days old, or hey, I'm 6 months old. So scheduler is a way that you can tell your app to do things on a time basis. And finally, commands. Again, with Remind, we showed a / command syntax. Command sort of makes that possible. It abstracts all the key pieces for that, so you can easily build commands of your own. Maybe my favorite, and something that's a relatively new feature to Probot, but I've used quite extensively, is test-driven development. So of course, everyone loves test-driven development until they have to do it, and then they kind of don't really do it. But to kind of write your test beforehand and build your functionality to it. So this is an example of what a test looks like in Probot right now. We use a test framework. You can easily say what we're testing. I used custom comments because I wanted to test a lot of different functionality. So I had previously in this test read the big JSON packet, basically of a webhook of something that it sent to my app at one point. And then programmatically, I changed different variables. In this case, I changed the comment itself to say no action required. I can then trigger Probot to receive this event as if it came in over the web. That's robot.receive. And then I can expect things. I can make call functions within my app to make sure that certain things happened as we expected them to. So again, I expect a GitHub API to be called. I expect them to actually reach out and try to read a file off the file system. And I expected them to read the probot-snooze YAML configuration file. So I not only mocked the response of that file, I was able to expect and require that it get called with those proper parameters. Those parameters, of course, were read from that original comment payload. I read the repo, I read the owner from it. So this was a way I could exercise my app. Where I use this more recently is I was building this Probot OpenShift integration. What this does is whenever a PR gets opened in GitHub, it went ahead and created the Kubernetes-based infrastructure for a whole new environment to test that PR independently. So PR got opened. It went ahead and spun off a bunch of, read the configuration files, because they were doing infrastructure as code within the repositories, and spun up those containers within OpenShift. Well, this isn't something I wanted to test all the time, and quite frankly, I knew that my pull request was just going to be pull request.open. I don't even care what the contents of it was. So I used test-driven development just to kick off this flow over and over and over again as I worked on debugging and getting the right syntax of working with OpenShift. This let me take the GitHub piece out of the picture. Maybe this is more sensitive to me as I remember the early days of Probot. When I was testing an app like this, I was literally opening hundreds of comments. Testing, testing again. Why am I not receiving the webhook? Why am I still not receiving the webhook? OK, this should work. Why am I still not receiving the webhook? By now using the test framework, I'm able to automate all of that interaction. Also, you see at the bottom, similar to test-driven design, but one of the things we like to suggest is you should include dry run functionality within your app as well, especially when you're doing things like writing comments or changing files on the GitHub file system or within a repository. As an organization, you want to know what this is going to do before you turn it on for the first time. We have a lot of open source organizations who have turned on stale, because they said, great, we want to use this to help manage our comments and our interaction with the community, without thinking, well, I've been an open source project for 4.5 years. This is going to immediately comment on 900 open issues and close them all out. Maybe understanding, being able to run that as a dry run functionality so you can understand, OK, this is what I'm about to comment on, this is what it's going to say, and have that confidence before it goes and in bulk changes your entire repository is definitely a best practice. And finally, issue management. So there's a couple different things that fall under issue management. So as I mentioned earlier, things with stateless. These are sort of best practices for pulling back information on issues. Again, I prefer to use labels when finding issues or data that belongs to Probot. So for reminder, let's say, add a label to that issue called reminder. That way, when the reminder app is starting up later, instead of searching through all your issues, it knows just to search for the issues with the label reminder. Use metadata to make it easy to process the data out of the system. Well, yes, you wrote a parser to read that comment and to parse out the information. You could do that parsing again, but it's expensive, right? Go ahead and store that data in as metadata. One of the nice advantages of that, when you use the GitHub API and you pull back all of your issues, one of the things that comes back is that first comment, is that op. To read the rest of the comments, you have to make subsequent calls to the API and say, give me all the rest of the comments. When you store your data as metadata, it's then in that first comment, so it comes back when you just say list all issues. So when I went to using metadata from my old process, I went from making hundreds of REST calls into my repository when starting up an app to just making one. Because now I can get all the information I need from that initial list all issues call, which is a good point at the bottom. Understand when you can use the search API and the different modifiers and accessors it gives you, and when you can use things like get all or list all for issues and pull requests. They operate a little bit differently. They give you a little bit different data back out. Some of them are better for different situations. So just do a little bit of reading yourself as to what one makes sense for your own use case. But keep in mind there are 2 different options to pull back all of that data. And finally, as I mentioned, pagination has been added into Probot, which isn't in the actual Node.js or Node GitHub SDK itself. So when you're dealing through issues with a lot of comments, currently I think the library defaults to 100 comments per page before you have to page over. Keep in mind that pagination is available and is your friend. It makes it much easier than doing it on the side. So at this point, you've seen the basics of Probot. Hopefully you understand why it's so important and why it's so great and why it answers all of these questions of building apps for your own specific workflows. It's open source. What is everyone in this room going to build next? It would not be fair for me to come up and speak about Probot without giving a quick shout out to all the people who have come well before me and done a lot of work on this platform. So again, Brandon, Bex, Lee, and Jason are some of the core contributors. When you go to GitHub/Probot/Probot, you'll see their names and faces and work all over not only the core Probot, but a lot of the different apps, extensions, and things around. But there's a bunch of other people who have helped out as well. Some of these are from GitHub. Some of these are from the community. I think currently Probot has over 27 contributors, so this is just a small fraction of them. But definitely want to give a nice round of applause to everyone who has helped make this possible. And I'll be around for Q&A. I have stickers and magnets if anyone's interested. But also want to give a quick point out of where you can interact and find more information about Probot, right? So of course, github.com/Probot is the organization where all of this lives. There's actually a friction repository within that. So as you're building apps yourself, as you're working with the SDKs and the APIs and the tooling, and you find things that don't exactly work like you expect or could be made to work better, open up an issue. You'll find things, I think there's already 20 or 30 issues in there where people are talking about concerns they have, and it's helping us directly impact where the platform goes next. There's a Slack team, probot-talk.slack.com, and of course, Probot, like any good robots, on Twitter. Probot the robot will be happy to tweet back at you. Again, I'm Jamie. You can find me on the social medias or JB Jones Jr. at github.com. I look forward to talking to you more. Thank you all for your time today.